All right, so we do have a special guest today. His name is Dr. Joey Young. He's from Texas Tech University, Reckham. That's where I did 2 of my degrees. So always love to have some Red Raiders on here when I can sneak them in. So Joey's been doing a lot of research lately looking at organic matter and carbon sequestration in turf. And so he's going to share some of that with us today, which I thought would be a really interesting topic. We do have a lot of questions. Chrissy and I both get a lot of questions lately about new organic products, managing organic matter and having healthier soils in turf, and what are some of the benefits that we can get around some of that. So I think this will be a nice, timely topic. And I'm going to, Joey, let you kind of take it away from here.
All right. Thanks, Becky. And thanks, everybody on the committee for having me come and give the talk today. I'm jumping out of a meeting during program review, and I've been doing that all day for the last 2 days. So this is a nice little break, lunch break, I guess, to be able to jump out of there and do something a little bit more fun. So the title of the presentation is going to be What Lies Beneath Your Turfgrass Landscape. So we often think about things that are going on above ground, but it's often a little bit more difficult to think about things that are below ground. So I am coming to you from Lubbock, Texas. And if you've ever been to Lubbock, especially via a plane, this is pretty much what you see whenever you are getting close to Lubbock, at least. We are in an agriculturally dominated part of Texas. So that's the biggest thing that really happens around here. And so as we produce these agricultural crops in this region, cotton being the biggest one, of course. And then we have other forages and other things around here too. But with cotton production, typical cultivation practices disrupt the soil. There's lots of periods where we have open land, which is a really beautiful this time of year because the land tends to move from the land to the sky, and we get nice, wonderful dust storms. We've recently had a large number of those. It seems that we've been having those really consistently with the heavy winds that we've been having here lately. And ultimately, there's very little accumulation of carbon or organic matter in the soil, which really sprung and really led to a large demand and a greater need within the agricultural community, at least, to discuss ideas related to soil health and how the health of a soil, the health of a soil can play a pivotal role in the effectiveness of being able to grow crops more effectively, limit some of the inputs that we have with crops. It kind of was an interesting figure that I found. This is from the USDA, and again, it's a little bit more geared towards agronomic crops and some of those heavily cultivated soils that we have, and very, very minimal amounts of organic matter and carbon in the soil. But for every 1% increase in organic matter, that can result in 20,000 gallons of available water per acre. With an agricultural crop, it's not that crazy to see organic matter levels of about 1 to 2%. But in a turf grass system, you're going to see that it's very possible for us to get anywhere from about 3, 5, even more than 5% organic matter. So just thinking about the enormous amount of water that means that we can hold in our landscape is really critical and an important thing to think about and compare if we're talking about, both ideas related to soil health, but also managing irrigation, with turf grasses and other things that we're trying to grow in our landscapes. So another factor of soil health relates to the microorganisms. There's tons and tons of life in our soils overall. So there's fungi, bacteria, protozoa, and arthropods, just to name a few. And these are little microscopic organisms. We're not talking about the earthworms and the more macroscopic things that we can really see. We're talking about the very, very minuscule. And so there's hundreds of millions of these things in a very, very small handful of soil. And they provide many, many benefits, but namely they help decompose things so we're not just like covered up in dead things all over the place. And they also really benefit with nutrient cycling. Things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur really become available in the soil because of the activity of these little microbes that are in our soil. So you really want to think about these things again in terms of how much life there is truly in this little small area of turf grass that we may manage within a landscape. Another thing to think about is just the real abundance of turf grass in some different places. This is a map of the United States that was produced in probably the mid 2000s. And it was a satellite imagery kind of thing. And the authors were actually, I think, looking at satellite imagery to try and figure out like coverage of interstate and road systems. And they ended up kind of finding this really interesting facet with this large, enormous amount of turf grass that was covering the United States overall. And so if we kind of dig into this a little bit more, I know this is real blurry, so I apologize for that. But if we kind of really focus in on Texas, the real obvious thing that you see as you look at these little green dots, and it may seem like it's relatively minimal, but one of the obvious things is our larger urban cities are the things that really stand out here. So whether it's Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Lubbock, Amarillo, Midland, Odessa, San Angelo. You kind of start to look at these little dots, you can kind of pick out cities. I'm not from Texas originally, so my Texas geography isn't good enough for me to probably point to all of those little cities. But those are all things that you can clearly see with this map. You can see different places that there definitely is a lot of turf grass. In our urban areas are where we do tend to see the largest abundance of turf grass because we have homes. And around our homes, in most cases, we tend to often plant turf grasses. We expect a lot out of those turf grasses, but unfortunately, in a lot of places, this is not an uncommon picture of what we may see whenever we have new construction in different areas. So this is in Lubbock. This picture, this image really brought to mind some ideas that I wanted to pursue from a research perspective, and that's what I'm really going to be talking about today. But I'm not sure about other parts of Texas, but within Lubbock, building a house, there's, initially in the building process, there's often, I would maybe say trash piles where you get lots of concrete, some of the extra stuff that, maybe wasn't necessarily used in the building of the house. And you kind of make a big pile and hopefully it gets scooped off before it's time to start really putting in landscape. But you can see there's not a whole lot done early on to try and create a good situation to try to grow plants. And then as the home is completed, you kind of look at the next picture in the bottom right. This is what it looks like in Lubbock for sure. I know there are some parts of Texas where there may be some ordinances or suggestions and recommendations about, improving soil with organic matter or adding so much topsoil back to the land before you put in the landscaping. But in Lubbock, that's not the case. And so what we tend to see is you basically remove all the trash, you flatten it, you put the soil down. This is after the irrigation has been installed in the landscape. And then the sod is laid, the water is turned on for 1 or 2 weeks, and then the sod is expected to grow, be healthy, and do perfect. And whenever it doesn't, then oftentimes the grass gets kind of the bad end of the rap whenever ultimately it probably wasn't really the grass's fault that there's limited nutritional value in the soil, it's compacted, there's no organic matter, it's very difficult for water to infiltrate that system. So, this is kind of where we ultimately started. And as we were looking at this, it kind of brought on some questions related to this turf grass system. It's a perennial system. Turf grasses have fibrous roots, very dense foliar cover, which all of these things should be helping the landscape to ultimately promote increased organic matter, which in turn should lead to carbon sequestration, improved microbial populations, and the benefits of those things that we're seeing should all be really prevalent. So this is kind of a little image that just kind of shows the carbon cycle within an urban landscape. So we have the wonderful benefit of the plants within the landscape, whether it's turf grass, trees, shrubs, perennial flowers, whatever you have in your landscape that is a plant is photosynthesizing. And as those plants are photosynthesizing, they are taking carbon out of the atmosphere and they are converting it into a more stable form of carbon, which is a huge benefit that our landscapes are providing. Just one of those ecosystem services that are being provided by the healthy growing plants within our landscape. And as it's doing so, there's going to be an increase in organic matter, which that leads to increased water holding potential and other great benefits. But at the same time, the management practices that we're putting into this landscape to just manage it on a normal basis, whether that's mowing, pruning, fertility, irrigation, all of those things come with a cost. And the cost is often an evolution of carbon. So, it's like we're trying to kind of find a little bit of a balance here, trying to determine where the landscape sits in regards to acquisition of carbon from the atmosphere, as well as evolution when we're starting to think about microbial activity, but also the management activities of our landscapes. So we desired and we wanted to try and determine basically how over time, how does the management and or time influence the carbon and nitrogen cycle with fertilization, mowing, and irrigation practices? And then ultimately, are we accumulating organic matter in landscapes? And in doing so, are we potentially reducing the irrigation demand that should be prevalent within our turfgrass landscapes? Or are we also reducing nitrogen and fertility needs as those organic matter, as the soil organic matter accumulates over time? So those are some general questions that we were curious about and wanting to see the progression from new construction all the way to older homes, at least in the Lubbock area. So what we did is we identified 10 residential homes within 4 different age categories, and these were all located within Lubbock. So we had old homes that were built between 1950 and 1970. Middle-aged homes were built between 1971 and 1990. Newer homes were 1991 to 2010. And then the newest set of homes were built within the last 10 or so years, from 2011 to present, which at the time we started doing the study in 2019. So probably a little bit less than 10 years. And we basically went around and collected soil cores, similar to the one that you see in the picture here. This is a 4-inch soil core. And so for bulk density, we actually cut this in half, and we had kind of an upper 2 inches and a lower 2 inches. But all of our other measurements were taken on a 4-inch sample. Now, if you're real familiar with soil testing, you might recognize that that's a couple of inches short of what we would typically recommend as being 6 inches. But as we're starting to look at carbon and organic matter, the highest percentage of that is going to be focused in the upper portion of the soil. So if we started getting deeper down into the soil profile, we would have gotten quantifiably more organic matter and carbon, but at the same time, we would have also been diluting the kind of concentration of those things as well. So we stuck with the top 4 inches as our total depth. And so as we talk about data and things that we saw, just recognize that it's coming from the top 4 inches. As we go deeper, there would be a greater quantity of those things located deeper in the soil. So for each one of the yards that we sampled, we provided a short survey just to the homeowner to get a general feel for how their lawn and landscape was ultimately managed. Did they do it on their own, or did they have somebody, a commercial business, come in and do things for them? Did they apply fertilizer or not to their lawn? What seasons would they apply fertilizer? Same questions about pesticides, whether it be herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, or no pesticide applications at all. We asked questions about irrigation, whether their lawn was irrigated or not, how frequently they irrigated, whether they had an in-ground irrigation system or not. And then the last question was really interesting. I don't have any data to provide about this, but we wanted to know whether the homeowners had ever had a soil test done before. And I'm pretty sure the 40 yards that we did, maybe one or two had a soil test before. It's definitely not prevalent that you would see soil testing within landscapes, at least to make good, sound fertility decisions. And I know there are a lot of numbers here that ultimately kind of indicate the responses from our survey. You can see that from an irrigation standpoint, irrigation is very commonly applied, at least in Lubbock. We're in a very dry climate, and so we don't get a terribly large amount of rainfall. I think if you're going to try to keep your grass green-ish, it's probably going to need to be watered and watered fairly commonly. You can see that some of these yards are getting watered pretty frequently. Clipping collection was kind of a question related to mowing, whether people return their clippings or picking them up and removing them from the landscape. And then fertilization, most of the yards were fertilized. Very few of the yards kind of really went through like a very, very minimal management kind of situation. Okay, so these are more of the like specific data, and there's even more numbers here. So just to kind of orient you with this table, you have bulk density here in the first column, soil pH, soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, total nitrogen, and then phosphorus. And these were all soil data that we collected where there was a significant difference at some point within the age group that we were looking at. So newest, newer, middle-aged, and oldest. For bulk density, you can see that there's a decrease in bulk density as the homes aged. So what that means is that basically there's less compaction. A high bulk density number means that you're going to have more compaction, which is expected with construction and different things. But as the plants become placed and they're growing, the fibrous root systems, the addition of water and fertility, there's ultimately this kind of fracturing of the soil that allows for better water penetration, water holding, and all these different things are really beneficial. So we had about a 14.5% reduction in bulk density comparing the newest and the oldest homes. The soil pH, we tend to have relatively high alkaline type soils here in Lubbock, so the higher soil pHs, but as organic matter increased, we actually saw a reduction in the soil pH, which is great. That means that we're hopefully freeing up a few more nutrients to be available for the plants, which is wonderful. Soil organic matter, it increased significantly between the newest, the newer, and then ultimately kind of plateaued here in the middle age where it stays about the same. So again, about 3.1 to 3.6% is what we were seeing in the upper 4 inches. On the carbon side of things, these numbers are in kilograms of carbon per meter squared, but I did the conversion and the newest homes were at 2.4 tons of carbon per acre. And then we get 3.25 tons of carbon per acre here in the newer homes. But then you can see, again, we max out in the middle and oldest homes at 5 and then 4.8 tons per acre. So you think about that in terms of the depth, there's nearly 5 tons of carbon in that oldest home age. So we're going to break that down by an accumulation per year to be a little bit more meaningful here in a second. Similar trends with nitrogen in the landscape. The older landscapes were holding more nitrogen, again, probably having to do with the greater organic matter content. And then phosphorus was also relatively similar with older homes holding more of those nutrients. This may help us to indicate that we could utilize less fertility in those landscapes that were older and then had more mature plant materials, as well as just an increased amount of nutrient availability overall. So one of the interesting things that we saw is a kind of a linear reduction in bulk density as that soil organic matter increased. And so this was pretty consistent. This is not really looking at the age of the homes, but more so just looking at the data itself, where we do see this reduction in bulk density. So ultimately, bulk density was decreasing by 0.1 grams per cubic centimeter with each increase in soil organic matter percentage. So over the course of time, we're seeing that reduction, and it was relatively consistent as we looked across yards of different ages. So what about those little microbes? What about those things that we can't necessarily see, but make this soil a living, breathing organism, even though we don't really think about it in that way a lot? So one of the first categories here is just kind of a larger number to estimate the number of microbes present, not really distinguishing one from another, but that's kind of what this MBC and MBN are gonna reflect, not really distinguishing fungi from bacteria, just kind of an over-encompassing microbial biomass carbon and microbial biomass nitrogen. And here again, you can see that as the homes aged and the lawns aged, there was an increase in microbial biomass. And that was consistent with sampling that we did in 2018 and 2019. We thought that there may be a little bit more variation with things like the microbial populations. Because of the fact that they're living organisms, there would be greater potential for shifts with environmental changes like drought or maybe season when we actually go and sample, some different things like that. But ultimately, we saw consistency that as the lawns aged, then the microbial biomass was increasing, indicating that there were just more microbes overall. And this slide really digs into more of the specifics, really trying to dig into, okay, how are fungi changing, bacteria, and then specific bacteria, gram-positive and gram-negative. And there ultimately wasn't a difference in fungi comparing the newest and the oldest homes. In contrast, there were some really big shifts looking at the newest homes to the oldest homes, where we saw increased magnitude of bacteria. And this is a little bit counterintuitive to the typical soil health dynamics that we would identify as beneficial if you're looking in the agricultural sector, because they tend to see this really bigger shift in the fungi as a more healthy soil. But I think what this points out is it points out some of the effects of our management practices in our landscapes. We tend to have higher fertility applications. We're making supplemental fertility applications consistently in order to promote growth of our plant materials. And in doing so, we're really promoting the growth of the bacterial population kind of at maybe the expense of the fungal population. You can see the fungal population is basically staying relatively consistent. You're not seeing a difference in that value statistically whenever we look at it down across these different age ranges for either one of these years, but you do see a big shift in the bacteria. So I think that was a really interesting finding, and that was consistent as well with things that have been done really across the country, not just in Lubbock in this kind of unique environment. And so we really, one of the things that we wanted to try and determine, which we didn't have a lot of success with, is we wanted to try and determine what kind of impact the management practices in the landscape were having on the microbial populations. And so we did a special kind of analysis where you're trying to like separate out different groups. And you can see when we look at age groups, there's nice separation. You get these basically these rectangles of like sampled areas that aren't connected with another. Like, for instance, these like oldest and middle over here are kind of overlapping. So there's similarity in those groups based on age, but the newest ones are completely different. So that's kind of the way you would ultimately look at this. And that's the same that we saw in the second year of sampling. There's a complete shift from the newest homes into the newer, middle, and oldest homes. They're kind of starting to group together once they get into that, maybe older than 10 years of plant material being present. But in contrast, if you look at the management practices, high, moderate, and low, which were based on irrigation, fertility, and pesticides. So if a home applied all three of those inputs, then they were identified as a highly managed landscape. Moderate was 2 of the 3. Low was 1 or 0 of those 3 inputs that people would have wanted to put in. And you can see that it's just kind of a hodgepodge. It's kind of like, throwing a dart and it's sticking wherever. There's not any grouping that you can really pull out of that. So the management practices did not really influence the microbial populations in the way that maybe we anticipated or that we thought they would. So ultimately, this is kind of looking at more of a rate kind of idea. So how much are we accumulating per year? When we look at soil organic matter in our urban residential landscape, turf grass landscape, we're seeing a clear increase, a linear increase of 0.036% per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we are making progress at getting up to kind of a stable level here. With soil organic carbon, on the other hand, you can see that this isn't a straight line. It's actually going up and then it's kind of curving over. So what that is telling us is that between a home being built to a little over 60 years, probably about 63, 65 years, the carbon is reaching an equilibrium point. So basically the highest point of this line is going to be the highest level of carbon that could ultimately be captured. And so in the case of the residential lawn, it took 53.6 years to reach that maximum. And when we think about this number of years to reach a maximum, let's see, 1.15 is going to be about that 5 tons per acre. The accumulation rate is 0.1 tons of carbon per acre per year. Okay. Now, if we start thinking about that, one of the challenges that we might experience or someone may provide to us is just the idea that I believe, from my understanding, is that I think on average, most of us expend with our daily activities, travel, driving your car, flying to vacations, and all the different things that we do over the course of a year. The average American releases, I think it's about 18 to 27 tons of carbon per year. So, I think 1 acre of lawn, that's a relatively small size. You think about a neighborhood or even expanding it into like Dallas, Fort Worth, you have tons and tons and tons of acres of turf grass that are accumulating small portions of carbon each year. So it may be easy to look at that number and say that's minuscule, it means nothing, it's not really changing anything. And in some degree, you could probably argue that point. But when you start looking at the magnitude of turf grass coverage in our urban areas, then it should be something at least notable to consider the level of carbon that's actually going into the soil and the benefit that ultimately provides. So in the same way, this is a similar kind of graph to what we saw previously, where we're trying to group and move things around. But this one is more so based on some of our different soil parameters that we were putting into the analysis. And ultimately, what this is indicating is that some of the things that are pulling these different groups in basically the X direction are soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, bulk density. And if you remember, those are soil parameters that were highly regulated by the age of the lawn. So you kind of get this shift in this X direction, which is pulling based on soil parameters that are truly affected by age. And then in contrast, if you start to look at separation in the Y direction, like up and down, we see things like soil textural differences, higher sand content, clay, CEC, and you can see that shifting things in this direction. But we don't really see a whole lot of separation in this Y direction as much as we see in the X direction. And so that's another principle, another way that we ultimately came to the conclusion that time is the biggest component when we start thinking about really soil health in a landscape. Time is the biggest component that's really adding lots of benefit. Now, our study was limited in some respects because we were just sampling in Lubbock. So there are many, many different factors that would play a role in carbon sequestration, the level of sequestration based on climate and environment, the soil texture in the area that you're ultimately sampling, previous land use. So you go from like a forage grassland to a residential home, and it's going to likely have a lot more organic matter present. But if you go from cultivated agriculture to a residential lawn, which is what we typically do here in the Lubbock area, then there's a real minimal amount of carbon in the soil to begin with. And so then there's a greater potential to accumulate, and maybe an extended period of time that we're accumulating carbon in those landscapes when we go from agricultural to residential. And then management practices, ultimately, we thought they would be very meaningful, but ultimately the data didn't necessarily suggest that were to be the case. And so, as I mentioned, our study was a smaller scale, but this is a table of data from a larger view, kind of a review kind of article on carbon sequestration within home lawns throughout the US. Slightly deeper soil sample here, 15 centimeters is going to be 7.5 inches, so an extra 2.5 inches of soil. But the cool thing about this is you can look at, anywhere from New Mexico, very dry climate, Georgia is very humid, Wyoming, this even has Dallas, kind of coming in at a rate of about, this would be 0.19 on that same scale that we were using before, and then about 3.9 that'd be kilograms of carbon per meter squared. So if you're doing the conversion, it should just be 1 decimal place over to be in the same number that I was presenting a little bit earlier. So you can see that there's a wide range in what's really possible based on climate and some of those other factors that we talked about when thinking about carbon sequestration in residential lawns. So based on the literature related to soil organic carbon accumulation and carbon sequestration, the rate can be anywhere from about 0.08 to 2.27 tons of carbon per acre per year. That's the amount of accumulation that you would potentially see. And again, for us in Lubbock, we are very warm, we're very dry, and that likely was contributing to some of the differences, the low value that we saw. Interestingly enough, I didn't present this data because it was relevant but not really relevant, is a few years prior to doing this study, we did a similar study using golf course fairways, and we got almost the exact same rate of accumulation for Bermuda grass in a golf course fairway as we did in the residential lawns. So again, I mean, think about how different a golf course fairway is managed compared to a residential lawn. They're worlds apart in how they're managed, but yet the rate of accumulation stayed consistent across the board. So as much as we think management may be playing a big role, the data doesn't necessarily seem to support that. Ultimately, time was the most critical thing. And so the more time that a landscape was present, then there was an accumulation of carbon. microbial communities increase, they can be more active. That really should help with things like water infiltration, water storage, maybe reducing the need for fertility in the landscape, because of the fact that there's this increased amount of organic matter, which can lead to just releases of nitrogen and other key nutrients over the course of time. This image is like just a comparison of some of the newest landscapes versus some of the oldest landscapes. Just look at the difference in the soil. Look at the, this one on the right, you could literally break it apart and like crumble it up in your hand. This one here is like stuck together, it's thick, like it would take forever to try to break that into small pieces and ultimately analyze what was going on. So looking again, thinking about this in terms of water holding and infiltration, a lot of our cultivated agricultural fields in this region, at least, probably have about 1% to 2% organic matter, whereas our turf grass system was getting up to, on average, about 3.5 in that oldest group. But we've definitely seen higher numbers, and you might see a little bit lower numbers depending on where you are. Again, management practices, you would think would be playing a role in that, but ultimately, time is probably the biggest category that's meaningful. And then also, I think one of the key things is using this information to promote water conservation, especially as lawns begin to age and that organic matter starts to kind of creep up in percentage. That may be a good indication that the landscape itself may not need to be watered as frequently or as much, especially in a climate like Lubbock, where we have a lot of issues with water conservation and different things. So, I'd really like to thank, in kind of putting some of these things together, there were a number of different funding organizations that helped us to complete a couple of different studies. The primary one that funded the work that we talked about related to the residential areas was the High Plains Water District here in Lubbock. So they're a water conservation district, and they provided the funding for us to do the sampling and all of the activities that we ultimately pursued. And so I've had opportunities to present this in a few different places, and even wrote a brief article, a newsletter article for the Texas Turfgrass Association at the beginning of the year, which was released. And so if you're interested in digging into that a little bit more, there's some written resources out there in addition to what we did today. So, and also just thanks to all those who were on today and listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions that y'all have. And if you need to contact me outside of this particular opportunity, my contact information is all listed here on the screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joey. We really appreciate your time. I know you have a busy schedule this week, so especially appreciate it. I guess I'm not seeing any questions come through in the chat. If you guys have any, please let us know. And if not, I'll probably let Dr. Young go here so he can get back to some of his other obligations, and we can chat a little bit more about other things that are coming up on Chat with Green Aggies. So Joey, I'm not seeing anything come through. So
okay, perfect.
I think we'll let you go so you can get back into your reviewing, and thank you again for your time, and we'll talk more soon.
Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks for the invitation to present, Becky, and to the group overall.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, so just a few things before we wrap up, and I'll invite some of our other specialists to join me here in these last few moments. I'm not sure, are you guys seeing my presentation mode or my other mode?
Your other mode.
Yeah, other mode.
Okay, let me see here. Any better? I swapped displays and it doesn't fix anything.
It's like not even in presentation mode.
Yeah.
How odd.
So you might be sharing the PowerPoint instead of your desktop. Is that? Oh, it did something for a split second there.
Yeah. Now I'm trying to do it. It's different now.
Okay.
Fine.
I think you're okay. I mean, it's not in presentation mode still, but Are you
Okay,
sharing
well, we're just-
PowerPoint instead of a desktop?
Yes, because I can't share my desktop currently, Irfan. Not all of us live the organized life that you lead with.
Well, yeah, we want to see all the mess that you got open
You
right
just
now.
have to size it appropriately where it covers up.
I
almost-
live in like a permanent state of multitasking where I have 400 windows open at all times. So I think this is fine for what we need to talk
Yeah,
about.
it's fine.
So just a couple things. First, I know Irfan has talked about this on here before, but if you're looking for archived videos, please check out the Texas Plant Clinic YouTube page. You'll be able to find all of our previous programs archived on there to go back and review. We also ask that you please help us out, fill out a survey to provide some feedback on our program.
Hang on, Becky, are you actually flicking? Are you going through the slides?
Becky,
I
can you go
am.
to the second slide? So
Yeah,
I did.
hit escape, get out of presentation mode, and then just like manually go through it because it's not actually
Oh
even
my
changing the
goodness.
slides.
It's weird because what I'm seeing is obviously not what you guys are saying, so that's fine.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah, we see the QR code for the survey now. And I've just put
Okay,
the link in the chat
perfect.
as well.
Yeah. Okay, so my chat window disappeared. Hold on. Here it
No,
comes.
I put it in the chat.
Oh,
You're
you
good.
did. Oh,
Yeah,
you
yeah, I
did.
put it
Okay,
in there.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yes, so you guys can use this QR code or you can use the link that Irfan provided in the chat to help us complete this survey. This is our schedule for this month. I don't know, Mung, would you like to kind of do a plug for next week since you coordinated the host for that one?
Sure. So Dr. Owens, this is going to be his third visit with us. He did his first visit last year, and then he visited with us last month, talking about some of the practices not so recommended, in landscape management. Dr. Owens has been working after he retired from extension. He has been working with 2 nurseries, one retail and one wholesale. So he is at the very front end of a lot of new plant materials. So that's going to be his talk next week with us. And I have just confirmed with Dr. Owens that, hey, April the 15th. So we're all set. We're all set for the April 15th. What's new with landscape plants, varieties, improvement, and new offerings. So this is going to be very exciting, as he has knowledge from both the wholesale and the production nursery side and also the retail nursery side. So I'm really excited about his visit with us next week. So
Yeah, I think that'll be a great one. And we do have 5 weeks this month, which means that we have the luxury of having kind of a special program toward the end of the month. And we will be reaching out this week to get some input from some of our green industry professionals. So you might see this show up in some of our professional listservs, a link requesting kind of questions that you guys may have on timely topics that we can address on the program. I think it'll be similar in structure to our winter emergency program that we conducted for professionals. But instead of being worried about a catastrophic winter storm, it'll be a little lighter and more general. So please keep an eye out for that, and so that we can get some of those ideas in. And then we do also have our quarterly program up as well. You'll be able to find it on several of our Facebook pages. And here it is here if you want to take a little screenshot or a photo with your phone. For all of our programs that are coming up, our next CEU program will be offered the first week in May during Arboriculture Week. So we're going to have Dr. Dave Apple on and we'll offer a CEU that week. And so if you're keeping an eye out for those in particular, there you go. And as always, thank you so much for joining us. And